The candle on the table shook when the door slammed shut behind him. Duke Alaric Wintermere stormed into the private drawing room of Ravensmoor Hall, his boots striking the polished floor like small explosions. His friend, Edmund Clark, had barely finished his sentence before Alaric cut him off, his voice sharp and certain. "She will never leave me," Alaric said, pouring 2 glasses of brandy without looking up. "Eliza is not like the others. She knows what she has here. She knows what I give her." Edmund raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had heard this kind of confidence from Alaric before, about horses, about business deals, about people. Alaric always believed the world would bend to his will, simply because he expected it to. "You sound very sure for a man who keeps his mistress hidden in the East Wing," Edmund said carefully, testing the waters. "Women grow tired of shadows, Alaric, even the most patient ones." Alaric laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Eliza is grateful. She came from nothing. A small house at the edge of Thornbury village, a father who could barely feed her, and now she wears silk and eats from silver plates. She will never leave that behind. She will never leave me." He said it again, as if repeating the words could make them more true. He believed it completely. He had no reason not to. For 2 years, Eliza Hartwell had been steady, quiet, devoted. She never asked for more than he offered. She never made demands. She simply waited for him, always in the same room, always with the same soft smile when he returned from his travels, or his meetings, or his long nights with men like Edmund. What Alaric did not know, what he could not see, because he had never truly looked, was that Eliza's smile had begun to change months ago. It was still soft, still warm on the surface, but underneath, it had grown tired, worn thin, like fabric pulled too many times in the same direction. Eliza sat in her room upstairs that very evening, a small candle flickering beside her, a needle and thread in her hands, as she mended the hem of a dress she rarely wore in public. She could hear muffled voices from the drawing room below, though she could not make out the words. She did not need to. She had heard enough conversations like it before. Men speaking about her as though she were a possession, a fixture in the house, something reliable and unchanging, like the grandfather clock in the hallway, or the portraits on the wall. She placed the needle down and looked toward the window. Outside, the moon hung low over the hills, and somewhere beyond those hills was Thornbury, the village she had left behind. She thought of her mother, long past, and her younger sister Charlotte, who still lived there with an aunt, working long hours at a bakery to make ends meet. Eliza sent money when she could, small amounts slipped into letters, never enough to explain where it truly came from. She thought of how she had met Alaric, 3 years ago now, in the village market on a cold autumn morning. She had been selling her mother's preserves at a small stall, her hands red from the chill, when a carriage stopped nearby, and a tall man stepped out, dressed finer than anyone she had ever seen in person. He had approached her stall, picked up a jar of preserves, and asked her name with a smile that made her forget the cold for a moment. She had not known then who he was. She had not known about the title, the estate, the wealth that came with his name. She had only seen a man who looked at her as though she mattered, who spoke to her as an equal, even though she wore a simple wool dress and worn boots. It was only later, after he had returned to the market 3 more times, after he had asked her to walk with him along the river, that she learned he was a duke. By then it was too late. She had already begun to feel something for him, something she could not easily undo. When he offered her a place at Ravensmoor Hall, promising her safety, comfort, and eventually, he said, a proper place in his life, she had believed him completely. She had left Thornbury with a small bag of belongings and a heart full of hope. That hope had carried her through the first year easily. Alaric was attentive then, visiting her chambers often, bringing her small gifts, telling her stories of his travels. She did not mind being hidden from society at first, because she believed it was temporary, a private matter that would resolve itself once he found the right moment to introduce her properly. But months turned into a year, and a year turned into 2, and the right moment never seemed to come. Instead, Alaric grew more comfortable with the arrangement exactly as it was. He no longer spoke of introducing her to anyone. He no longer mentioned the future at all. He simply enjoyed her company when it suited him, and expected her to remain patient the rest of the time. Eliza folded the dress she had been mending and set it aside. She rose from her chair and walked to the small writing desk near the window, where a stack of blank paper waited, along with an inkwell she rarely used. She stared at the paper for a long moment, her fingers hovering above it. She had discovered the truth about her condition only a week earlier. A physician from a nearby town, brought in quietly under a false explanation of a headache remedy, had confirmed what she already suspected. She was carrying a child, Alaric's child. The realization had filled her with a mixture of fear and something else, something she had not expected. A quiet, steady resolve. She could not raise a child in secret. She could not let her son or daughter grow up hidden away in the east wing of a grand house, unacknowledged, unnamed in any official record, treated as an inconvenient truth rather than a person. She thought of her own childhood, difficult as it had been, but at least she had known who she was and where she belonged. She would not deny her child even that much. Downstairs, the conversation between Alaric and Edmund continued long into the night. Edmund tried once more to press the matter, curious despite himself. And what of her family? Does she never speak of returning to see them? Alaric shook his head. She writes to her sister sometimes, sends a little money. But she has made her choice. She chose this life. She chose me. A choice made 3 years ago is not always a choice a person still wants to keep, Edmund said quietly. But Alaric waved the comment away with his hand, refilling his glass instead of answering. He did not consider, even for a moment, that Eliza's silence over the past few months might mean something more than contentment. He did not notice that she had stopped asking when he might take her to visit his properties in the city, stopped inquiring about his plans for the coming season, stopped mentioning any future at all. He simply assumed her quiet nature was permanent, unchanging, safe. That night, after Edmund had retired to his guest chamber and the house had grown still, Alaric climbed the stairs toward Eliza's room, as he often did, expecting to find her waiting. He knocked twice, lightly, the way he always did, and when there was no answer, he assumed she had already fallen asleep. He opened the door gently, careful not to wake her if she was resting. The room was empty. Not simply quiet, not simply dark, but entirely empty. The bed was made, untouched. The candle on the writing desk had burned down to a small stub, its flame long extinguished. Her dresses still hung in the wardrobe. Her small collection of jewelry still sat in its box on the dresser. But there was an absence in the room that Alaric felt before he even understood it. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, confused rather than alarmed. Perhaps she had gone to the kitchen for tea. Perhaps she was walking in the garden, unable to sleep. He told himself these things as he turned and made his way down the back staircase, checking the kitchen first, then the small sitting room where she sometimes read in the evenings, then finally stepping out into the cool night air of the garden. She was nowhere. He called her name softly at first, not wanting to wake the rest of the household. But as the minutes passed and no answer came, his voice grew louder, more urgent. He walked the length of the garden twice, checked the stables, even climbed to the small observatory tower that Eliza had once mentioned she found peaceful. Nothing. No sign of her at all. It was only when he returned to her room, breathing harder now, his earlier confidence beginning to crack, that he noticed something he had missed before. A single folded piece of paper resting on the pillow, placed with careful precision, exactly where she knew he would eventually look. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. He told himself it trembled from the cold night air, nothing more. He unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the first few lines, and the words seemed to blur together as the weight of them settled over him. His mind, so certain only hours earlier, so confident in its own understanding of the world, struggled now to accept what was written plainly in front of him. She was gone. Eliza Hartwell, the woman he had called his own for 2 years, the woman he had declared to Edmund would never leave him, had walked out of Ravensmoor Hall sometime that very evening, while he sat comfortably downstairs, drinking brandy and speaking with such certainty about her loyalty. He read the first lines again, his throat tightening in a way he did not recognize, a feeling entirely foreign to a man who had spent his whole life expecting things to go exactly as he wished. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes gently, as though the house itself understood that something fundamental had shifted. Alaric stood alone in the empty room, the letter shaking slightly in his hand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not know what to do next. He thought of calling for the staff immediately, of sending riders in every direction to search the roads leading away from the estate. But something in the careful, deliberate folding of the letter told him this was not a woman who had run in a moment of panic or fear. This was a woman who had planned, who had waited, who had chosen her moment with the same quiet patience she had shown for 2 long years. He sat down slowly on the edge of the bed she had left behind, the letter still unread beyond its first lines, and for a long moment, the powerful Duke of Wintermere simply stared at the empty room, unable to fully grasp how thoroughly his certainty had betrayed him. Downstairs, the brandy glasses still sat on the table where he and Edmund had left them, half full, the conversation about Eliza's unwavering loyalty still hanging faintly in the air of the room, now proven entirely, undeniably wrong. The candle beside the bed flickered once more, before going dark, leaving Alaric alone in the shadows, with nothing but a letter he had not yet found the courage to finish reading, and a silence in the house that felt heavier than anything he had ever known. He did not call for the staff that night. He did not send riders down the road. He simply sat, letter in hand, staring at the empty space where Eliza used to be, beginning to understand, slowly and painfully, that the woman he had been so certain would never leave him had already been gone for hours, and he had not even noticed. The first light of dawn would bring questions he was not ready to answer, and a search that would test everything he thought he knew about the woman he had lost, and about himself. For now, there was only the letter, the empty room, and the quiet, terrible truth that certainty and reality were not always the same thing. Alaric finally lowered his eyes back to the page, forcing himself to read further, and what he found there would change the course of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. The letter trembled in Alaric's hands as he read the next lines, and every word felt like a small blow he had not braced for. Eliza had written plainly, without anger, without cruelty, but with a clarity that cut deeper than any harsh words could have. She explained that she was carrying his child, and that she could not, would not, raise that child hidden away in a house where the mother was never truly acknowledged, and the child would grow up nameless in the eyes of society. She wrote that she had loved him honestly, completely, from the very first day at the market stall, and that her love had not changed even now. But love, she said, was not enough to build a life on, when it came wrapped only in secrecy and quiet promises that never turned into anything real. Alaric read the letter 3 times before he could bring himself to fold it again. Each time, the words struck him with fresh force, as though his mind kept trying to reject what his eyes clearly saw. He had spent the evening boasting to Edmund about her loyalty, using words like certainty and permanence, and now those very words felt foolish, even cruel, in light of what she had written. He rose from the bed and walked to the window, looking out over the dark garden where he had searched for her only an hour before. Somewhere out there, beyond the boundaries of Ravensmoor, Eliza was walking away from everything he had given her, carrying a secret that would soon become impossible to hide, choosing uncertainty and hardship over the comfort he had provided. For a man who prided himself on control, on always knowing the outcome of every situation before it happened, this was an entirely new kind of helplessness. He did not know where she had gone. He did not know how far she had traveled, or whether she had taken a carriage, or walked, or found help from someone he did not know existed in her life. He realized, with a sinking discomfort, how little he actually knew about Eliza's inner world, despite 2 years of supposed closeness. He remembered small details now, pieces of conversation he had brushed aside at the time. She had once mentioned an aunt in a town called Millbrook, a place 2 days' ride from Ravensmoor, where her mother had grown up before moving to Thornbury. He had barely listened when she spoke of it, assuming it was simply idle conversation, the kind of family history that meant little in the grand scheme of his own busy life. Now that small detail felt like the only thread he had to follow. He also remembered Charlotte, Eliza's younger sister, still living in Thornbury with their aunt. Perhaps Eliza had gone there first, or perhaps she had avoided it entirely, knowing it would be the first place anyone might look for her. Alaric could not be certain, but he knew he needed answers, and he needed them quickly, before the trail grew cold. He considered waking the household staff immediately, but stopped himself. If word spread through Ravensmoor that his mistress had vanished in the night, it would not stay a private matter for long. Servants spoke to other servants, who spoke to servants in neighboring estates, and within days the story would reach every drawing room in the county. He could already imagine the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the quiet amusement of people who had always suspected he kept a woman hidden away in his home. It was not only Eliza's reputation at stake now, he realized, but his own as well, and perhaps more importantly, the reputation of the child she carried. If society learned the truth before he had a chance to make things right, the scandal could follow that child for the rest of their life. For the first time, Alaric felt the weight of consequences that extended beyond his own comfort and pride. He decided he would handle this quietly, using only people he trusted completely. Edmund, still awake in the guest chamber down the hall, seemed the obvious choice, though Alaric hesitated at the thought of admitting his mistake to his closest friend. Pride was a difficult thing to set aside, even in a moment like this. He knocked on Edmund's door just after midnight, and when Edmund opened it, still dressed, clearly not yet asleep, Alaric's expression alone must have told him something was deeply wrong. "She is gone," Alaric said simply, holding up the folded letter. "Eliza left tonight, while we sat downstairs talking about how she never would." Edmund's expression shifted from surprise to concern, though Alaric noticed, with a flicker of shame, that there was no real astonishment in his friend's eyes. Edmund had suspected something like this might happen eventually. He had tried to warn him, gently, more than once. "What does the letter say?" Edmund asked, stepping aside to let Alaric into the room. Alaric explained everything, his voice unsteady in a way he rarely allowed anyone to hear. He spoke of the child, of Eliza's reasons for leaving, of his own blindness to how deeply unhappy she had become, despite her quiet, patient exterior. Edmund listened without interrupting, and when Alaric finished, there was a long silence between them. "You must find her," Edmund finally said. "Not to force her back, Alaric, not to control her, but because she is carrying your child, and because, whether you admit it to yourself yet or not, you clearly still care for her deeply. I saw it in your face just now. That was not the face of a man who has simply lost a convenient arrangement." Alaric nodded slowly, grateful for his friend's steady presence, even as shame burned quietly beneath his skin. He had spent so many years believing that affection and loyalty were things owed to him, simply because of his title and his wealth. Tonight had shattered that belief completely, and he was only beginning to understand how much rebuilding it would take to become the kind of man Eliza might have stayed for in the first place. They spent the remaining hours before dawn planning quietly, careful to keep their voices low so the household staff would not overhear. Edmund suggested sending a single trusted rider toward Millbrook at first light, discreetly inquiring about a young woman traveling alone, without revealing her name or connection to Ravensmoor. Alaric agreed, though every part of him wanted to ride out immediately himself, chasing after her without any plan beyond simply finding her as quickly as possible. But Edmund cautioned patience. If you arrive suddenly, unannounced, demanding she return with you, you will only confirm every fear that made her leave in the first place. She needs to see that you understand why she left, before she will ever consider what comes next. The words settled uncomfortably in Alaric's chest, because he knew Edmund was right, even though every instinct urged him to act immediately, to fix the situation the way he fixed every other problem in his life, through sheer force of will and resources. This was different. Eliza was not a business deal to be closed, or a debt to be settled. She was a person who had made a difficult, painful choice, and rushing after her without understanding that choice would only push her further away. As dawn broke over Ravensmoor Hall, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pale blue, Alaric stood once more at the window of Eliza's empty room, the letter now folded carefully and placed in the inner pocket of his coat, close to his chest. The household would wake soon, and questions would inevitably arise about her absence. He would need a story, something that satisfied curiosity, without revealing the full truth. He decided he would tell the staff that Eliza had traveled to visit an ailing relative, a simple explanation that would buy him time, without inviting scandal. It was not entirely a lie, he told himself, since her aunt in Millbrook was indeed a relative, even if her true reasons for leaving had nothing to do with illness. Meanwhile, many miles away, Eliza sat inside a small hired carriage, watching the countryside slowly change from the familiar hills surrounding Ravensmoor to unfamiliar roads she had never traveled before. She had left in the early evening, while Alaric and Edmund were still deep in conversation downstairs, slipping out through the servants' entrance with only a single bag containing a few dresses, a small amount of money she had saved carefully over many months, and the letter she had spent hours composing and revising, until every word felt exactly right. Her heart had pounded the entire time she crossed the garden and made her way to the road where a hired driver, arranged discreetly through a contact she had made in the nearby village, waited to take her toward Millbrook. She had not told the driver her true reasons for traveling, only that she needed to reach her aunt's home as quickly and quietly as possible. As the carriage rattled along the dark road, Eliza placed a protective hand over her stomach, still barely showing any sign of the life growing within her, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to imagine a future that belonged entirely to her own choices. It was frightening, uncertain, and completely unlike the sheltered life she had grown used to at Ravensmoor. But it was also, in some strange way, the first time in years she felt truly free. She did not know, as the carriage carried her further from the estate, that Alaric would soon begin his own quiet search, driven not by anger or wounded pride alone, but by something he had never fully examined before, a genuine fear of losing something, someone, that mattered more than he had ever allowed himself to admit. The road ahead was long, and neither of them yet understood how far it would take them before their paths crossed again. The carriage rolled to a stop just as the first hint of morning light touched the rooftops of Millbrook, a small town Eliza had visited only once before, many years ago, as a child accompanying her mother on a rare journey to see distant family. She stepped down onto the cobblestone street, her legs stiff from the long ride, and looked around at a place that felt both familiar and entirely strange at once. She had written ahead to her aunt, a woman named Winifred, though she had not revealed the full truth in her letter, only that she needed a quiet place to stay for a while, and hoped her aunt might have room for her. She had not mentioned Alaric at all, nor the child she carried, unwilling to commit such details to paper in case the letter fell into the wrong hands before she arrived to explain everything in person. Winifred's home was a modest but well-kept cottage at the edge of town, with a small garden out front where herbs grew in neat rows. When Eliza knocked on the door, her aunt opened it with an expression of surprise that quickly softened into concern as she took in her niece's tired face and travel-worn clothing. "Eliza, my dear girl, what has happened to you?" Winifred asked, pulling her inside without waiting for an answer, settling her by the small kitchen fire and pressing a cup of warm tea into her hands before allowing any further conversation. Eliza explained slowly, carefully, choosing her words with the same precision she had used in her letter to Alaric. She spoke of the years spent at Ravensmoor, of the arrangement she had accepted out of love and youthful hope, and of the quiet unhappiness that had grown inside her as those years passed, without any real change in her circumstances. She spoke, finally, of the child, watching her aunt's expression shift from concern to something gentler, something that felt almost like understanding rather than judgment. "You did the right thing, coming here," Winifred said, taking Eliza's hand in her own weathered fingers. "A woman must know her own worth, even when the world tries to convince her otherwise. You will stay here as long as you need, and we will figure out the rest together." For the first time since leaving Ravensmoor, Eliza allowed herself to cry, not from sadness alone, but from the sheer relief of being somewhere safe, somewhere she did not have to hide any part of herself or her circumstances. The tears came freely, and Winifred simply held her hand and let her release the tension she had carried silently for so long. Over the following days, Eliza began to settle into a rhythm of life entirely different from anything she had known at the grand estate. She woke early, helped her aunt with small tasks around the cottage, and in the afternoons, she walked into town to see what work might be available. She had some experience with sewing, having learned from her mother as a child, and she soon found a small shop willing to take her on as a seamstress, mending and altering garments for the townspeople. The work was simple, sometimes tedious, and paid only modestly, but Eliza found a strange satisfaction in it that surprised her. Every coin she earned belonged entirely to her, the product of her own hands and effort, unlike the comfort she had grown accustomed to at Ravensmoor, which had always felt, in some quiet way, borrowed rather than truly hers. The shop owner, a widow named Margaret Alcott, took an immediate liking to Eliza, recognizing in her a quiet determination that reminded Margaret of her own younger years. Margaret had lost her husband to illness many years before, and had built her small business from nothing, learning through hard experience that a woman could survive, even thrive, without relying entirely on a man's protection. "You have skilled hands," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Eliza work carefully on the hem of a customer's dress. But more than that, you have a steady mind. That matters more in this world than people often realize. Eliza smiled at the compliment, though a shadow of worry crossed her face soon after. She had not told Margaret the full truth of her circumstances, only that she had left a difficult situation and needed a fresh start. She worried constantly about what would happen when her condition became more visible, when the small town would inevitably notice and begin to ask questions she was not yet ready to answer. Margaret, perceptive as she was, seemed to sense some of this unspoken worry, though she never pushed for details Eliza was unwilling to share. Instead, she simply continued to offer steady kindness, small gestures of support that helped Eliza feel, day by day, a little more capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Meanwhile, back at Ravensmore Hall, Alaric's carefully planned search had begun to unravel in ways he had not anticipated. The trusted writer Edmund had suggested sending toward Millbrook returned after 3 days with frustratingly little information. He had inquired discreetly at inns and market stalls along the road, but no one recalled seeing a young woman matching Eliza's description traveling alone. Alaric grew increasingly restless with each passing day of silence. The story he had given his household staff, that Eliza had traveled to visit an ailing relative, had begun to wear thin, as the days stretched into a week, and questions naturally arose about when she might return. He found himself fabricating additional details to maintain the illusion, each small lie adding to a growing weight of discomfort in his chest. Edmund, still staying at Ravensmore to support his friend through the crisis, grew concerned about Alaric's mounting frustration. "You cannot force this to resolve on your own timeline," he cautioned one evening, as they sat together, reviewing what little information they had gathered. "Eliza left deliberately, carefully. She will not be found easily unless she wishes to be found, or unless we approach this with far more patience than you are currently showing." Alaric ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. Sleep had come poorly since the night she left, his mind constantly replaying the conversation with Edmund in the drawing room, the careless confidence with which he had declared she would never leave him, only to discover, hours later, exactly how wrong he had been. "I keep thinking of small things," Alaric admitted quietly. "Things she mentioned that I never truly listened to. A favorite color. A book she once read twice because she loved it so much. I realize now how little attention I paid to who she actually was, beyond simply being present in my life." Edmund nodded slowly, recognizing in his friend's words the beginning of a genuine reckoning, something far more valuable than the frantic search efforts of the previous days. "Perhaps that is where you should begin," Edmund suggested. "Not with finding her location, but with truly understanding what you failed to give her, and what you would need to change if you ever hope to make things right." The words settled heavily in Alaric's mind over the following days. He found himself, for the first time in years, reflecting deeply on his own behavior, rather than simply reacting to circumstances as they arose. He thought of the many small moments he had dismissed as unimportant, conversations cut short because he had somewhere else to be, promises made casually and then forgotten entirely, affection given generously in private, but withheld entirely from public acknowledgement. He began, slowly and somewhat awkwardly, to make small changes in his own life, even before locating Eliza. He reached out to his younger cousin, a young man named Frederick, whom he had neglected for years due to a minor family dispute that now seemed entirely trivial in light of everything else happening. He softened his manner with the household staff, offering genuine thanks rather than the curt, distracted acknowledgments he usually gave. These changes were small, almost invisible to anyone who did not know him well, but Edmund noticed and quietly hoped they represented the beginning of real growth, rather than a temporary reaction to crisis that would fade once Eliza was eventually found. Word eventually reached Alaric, through a distant business contact who occasionally traveled through Millbrook, that a young woman matching Eliza's general description had recently begun working at a small seamstress shop in the town, staying with a relative at the edge of the community. The information was vague, second-hand, and entirely unconfirmed, but it was the first genuine lead Alaric had received since her disappearance, and it filled him with a nervous, uncertain hope he had not expected to feel so intensely. He did not act immediately, remembering Edmund's earlier caution about approaching the situation with patience rather than force. Instead, he spent several more days considering carefully what he actually intended to do once he confirmed Eliza's location. Did he intend to demand her return, as the arrogant version of himself from weeks earlier surely would have? Or did he intend something entirely different, something that acknowledged the genuine harm his behavior had caused, and offered real change rather than empty reassurance? The answer, he realized slowly, needed to be the latter, though he was not yet entirely certain what that change would look like in practice, or whether Eliza would even be willing to hear him out after everything that had happened. For now, he simply held on to the fragile lead about Millbrook, turning it over carefully in his mind, while continuing the quiet, internal work of examining exactly what kind of man he needed to become before he dared approach the woman he had so carelessly assumed would never leave him. 3 weeks had passed since Eliza arrived in Millbrook, and the town had slowly become something that felt, cautiously, like home. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her days, waking early to help her Aunt Winifred with the garden, before walking into town to spend long hours at Margaret's shop, her hands steady over needle and thread, even as her mind sometimes wandered back to Ravensmoor and the life she had left behind. She had not written to Alaric since leaving her letter on the pillow that night. Part of her wondered whether he had even searched for her at all, or whether he had simply accepted her absence and moved forward with his life as though nothing significant had changed. The thought brought a strange mixture of relief and quiet sadness whenever it crossed her mind, and she tried, as best she could, to focus instead on the practical matters of building a life for herself and her child. Her condition had become more noticeable in recent days, a gentle rounding of her stomach that she could no longer easily disguise beneath loose clothing. Margaret had noticed first, though she said nothing directly, simply adjusting Eliza's workload slightly to allow for more rest and fewer long hours bent over difficult stitching. It was Winifred who eventually broached the subject directly, sitting with Eliza by the fire one evening after the shop had closed for the day. "You will need to decide, eventually, what story you wish to tell people here," her aunt said gently. "Millbrook is a small town, and people will notice soon enough, whether you choose to explain it or not." Eliza had thought about this many times already, turning over various possibilities in her mind. She could claim to be a widow, a common enough story that would draw sympathy rather than judgment. She could simply refuse to discuss the matter at all, allowing people to speculate as they wished. Or she could tell the truth, at least in part, and accept whatever consequences came from that honesty. "I think I want to tell the truth," Eliza said finally, surprising herself slightly with how certain she felt saying the words aloud. "Not all of it, perhaps. I do not need to name him, or explain every detail of what happened. But I do not want to build this new life on another lie, even a small one, told to protect myself from judgment." Winifred nodded approvingly, though she cautioned her niece gently about the difficulties such honesty might bring. People can be unkind, even in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. But I have also found that genuine honesty, offered without shame, tends to earn more respect over time than any carefully constructed lie. The following week, Eliza decided to share her situation openly with Margaret, trusting the kindness the older woman had shown her since her arrival. She explained, in general terms, that she had left a difficult arrangement with a man of considerable standing, someone who had promised her a future that never fully materialized, and that she was now carrying his child, determined to raise the baby with dignity rather than shame. Margaret listened without judgment, her expression steady and understanding throughout the explanation. When Eliza finished speaking, Margaret reached across the small table between them and took her hand firmly. "You are not the first woman to find herself in such circumstances, and you will certainly not be the last. What matters now is how you choose to move forward, and from what I have seen of you these past weeks, I have no doubt you will manage it with grace." The support Eliza received from both her aunt and Margaret gave her a growing sense of confidence that she had not expected to find so quickly after such a difficult departure from Ravensmoor. She began to imagine, cautiously, a future where she raised her child independently, supported by the small community she was building in Millbrook, without ever needing to return to the life of hidden comfort she had left behind. Yet even as this confidence grew, quiet moments of doubt still crept in, particularly in the evenings, when she sat alone in her small room at Winifred's cottage, her hand resting gently on her stomach as she thought of Alaric. Despite everything, despite the pain and frustration that had driven her to leave, she could not entirely extinguish the affection she still felt for him. She wondered sometimes whether he thought of her at all, or whether her absence had simply become another minor inconvenience in his busy, privileged life. She reminded herself, during these moments of doubt, exactly why she had left in the first place. She thought of the years spent waiting for promises that never came, the quiet loneliness of being loved only in private while remaining invisible in public, the growing realization that Alaric's affection, however genuine it may have been, had never been paired with genuine respect for her as an equal partner rather than a convenient companion. Meanwhile, back at Ravensmoor, Alaric had finally decided to act on the information he had received about Millbrook, though he chose his approach carefully, mindful of Edmund's earlier warnings about rushing the situation. Rather than traveling to the town himself immediately, demanding to see Eliza, he instead sent a carefully worded letter, addressed generally enough that it would not draw unwanted attention if intercepted by anyone else, but clear enough that Eliza would understand exactly who had written it and why. In the letter, Alaric did not demand her return. He did not accuse her of abandoning him or question her decision to leave. Instead, he acknowledged, plainly and without excuse, the ways he had failed her over their years together. He wrote of his realization, painful and overdue, that he had treated her presence in his life as something owed to him, rather than something earned through genuine partnership and respect. He apologized, not with grand promises he was not yet prepared to fulfill, but with a simple acknowledgement that he understood, at least in part, why she had chosen to leave. He mentioned the child only briefly, careful not to pressure her with expectations about the future, simply expressing gratitude that she had trusted him enough, even in her letter explaining her departure, to tell him the truth about her condition, rather than disappearing entirely without any explanation at all. The letter arrived at Winifred's cottage on a quiet afternoon, delivered by a rider who asked no questions and simply confirmed the recipient's name before departing. Eliza recognized Alaric's handwriting immediately on the outside of the folded paper, and her hands trembled slightly as she carried it to her room, wanting privacy before she allowed herself to read whatever he had written. She sat on the edge of her bed for several long minutes before finally breaking the seal and unfolding the letter, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear that she could not entirely separate from one another. As she read his words, tears gathered in her eyes, though she could not immediately identify whether they came from lingering hurt, cautious relief, or something more complicated that combined both feelings at once. He had not written what she expected. She had feared anger, or worse, a cold demand for her immediate return, without any real acknowledgement of why she had left in the first place. Instead, she found genuine reflection, an honesty she had rarely seen from him during their years together, when his confidence and certainty had always seemed to leave little room for genuine vulnerability or self-examination. She read the letter 3 times, much as Alaric himself had read her own letter weeks earlier, each reading revealing new layers of meaning she had not fully absorbed the first time through. By the third reading, she found herself uncertain what to feel, torn between the cautious hope that perhaps he had genuinely begun to change, and the wary skepticism built from years of watching promises fade into empty routine. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small wooden box where she kept her few treasured belongings, deciding she needed time to consider her response, rather than reacting purely from the emotional turbulence the letter had stirred within her. Over the following days, she found herself returning to the letter repeatedly, rereading certain passages that struck her most deeply, particularly his acknowledgement that he had never truly listened to her as a person, focusing instead on the comfort and companionship she provided, without genuinely valuing her own hopes and needs. She discussed the matter carefully with Winifred and Margaret, both of whom offered gentle, thoughtful advice without pushing her toward any particular decision. "Words on paper are easy to write," Margaret observed one evening, as they sat together after closing the shop. "The true measure of change comes from actions sustained over time, not promises made in a single letter, however sincere it may seem in the moment." Eliza agreed, recognizing the wisdom in Margaret's caution, yet she also could not entirely dismiss the possibility that Alaric's letter represented a genuine beginning, rather than simply another empty gesture. She decided, eventually, that she would respond, though carefully, offering neither immediate forgiveness nor complete rejection, but rather an honest acknowledgement of her own feelings and a clear statement of what she would need to see before considering any return to a life connected with him. She spent an entire evening composing her response, choosing each word with the same careful precision she had used in her original departure letter. She explained her new life in Millbrook, the work she had found, the support of her aunt and Margaret, and the growing sense of independence and self-respect she had discovered since leaving Ravensmoor. She acknowledged his apology, expressing cautious appreciation for his honesty, but made clear that words alone would not be enough to rebuild the trust that had eroded over their years together. She ended the letter with a simple, direct statement, one that captured exactly where she stood in that moment. She was not closing the door entirely on the possibility of reconciliation, but neither was she prepared to abandon the independent life she was carefully building, simply because he had finally begun to recognize his own shortcomings. The letter was sealed and sent the following morning, carried by the same discreet rider who had delivered Alaric's original message, and as it traveled the long road back toward Ravensmoor, both Eliza and Alaric found themselves caught in an uncertain, anxious waiting period, each wondering exactly what the other's next move might be, and whether the distance between them could ever truly be closed. When Alaric received Eliza's reply, he read it standing in the very same drawing room where he had once boasted so confidently that she would never leave him. The irony was not lost on him, and he found himself grateful, in a strange way, that Edmund was not present to witness the vulnerability he no longer felt the need to hide entirely. Her words were measured, careful, honest in a way that reminded him of the woman he had first met at the village market, before years of comfortable routine had dulled his ability to truly see her. She had not rejected him outright, but neither had she offered the easy forgiveness he might once have expected, simply because he had finally acknowledged his mistakes. He understood, reading her letter carefully, that she required more than words. She required proof, sustained over time, that he had genuinely changed, rather than simply reacting to the shock of her departure. This realization settled into him with a quiet, sobering weight, and he began to consider seriously what such proof might actually look like. Edmund found him later that afternoon, still sitting with the letter in hand, staring at nothing in particular. "What will you do now?" Edmund asked, settling into the chair across from him. "I will not rush to Millbrook demanding anything," Alaric said slowly, as though testing the words for the first time. "I will instead show her, through my actions here, that I have genuinely begun to change, and when enough time has passed, that my changes cannot be dismissed as a temporary reaction to fear, I will go to her, not to demand her return, but to ask, honestly, whether she might consider a different kind of future with me." Edmund nodded, clearly pleased by the maturity in his friend's response, so different from the impulsive certainty Alaric had displayed only weeks earlier. "That sounds like wisdom, Alaric. Real wisdom, earned through genuine reflection rather than convenience." Over the following weeks, Alaric began making changes at Ravensmoor that extended well beyond his earlier gestures toward his cousin Frederick and the household staff. He began reviewing the estate's finances personally, rather than leaving everything entirely to his stewards, taking a genuine interest in the well-being of the tenant farmers, whose livelihoods depended on decisions he had previously made carelessly, without much thought for their actual circumstances. He also began, cautiously, to speak more openly among his social circle about his situation, no longer hiding behind vague explanations about Eliza's whereabouts. He did not reveal every detail, but he acknowledged to a small number of trusted acquaintances that he had a woman in his life whom he hoped, eventually, to marry properly, and a child on the way, whom he intended to acknowledge fully and publicly, regardless of the scandal such an admission might invite. This decision drew immediate reaction from certain corners of society. Lord Grantham Vale, a rival nobleman who had long harbored quiet resentment toward Alaric over an old business dispute, seized upon the rumor eagerly, spreading exaggerated versions of the story at gatherings and social events throughout the county. Within weeks, whispers had grown into open gossip, painting Alaric as a man who had fathered a child with a common seamstress and abandoned his responsibilities entirely. The rumors reached Millbrook eventually, distorted and exaggerated through multiple retellings, and Eliza found herself facing curious glances and pointed questions from townspeople who had somehow connected her circumstances to the scandal now circulating through wealthier social circles many miles away. She felt a familiar anxiety returning, the fear that her carefully built new life might crumble under the weight of a scandal she had never wanted any part of. Margaret, sensing her distress, offered steady reassurance during this difficult period, Rumors burn brightly for a short time, then fade when something new captures people's attention, she said one evening, as they worked together in the shop after most customers had left for the day. What matters is how you conduct yourself through it, not the gossip itself. Eliza took comfort in these words, though she could not entirely shake the worry that the scandal might eventually reach a point where it threatened not only her reputation, but her ability to continue building a stable, respectable life for herself and her child in Millbrook. Back at Ravensmoor, Alaric faced his own difficult reckoning with the growing scandal. Lord Vale's exaggerated version of events had painted him in an unflattering light among his peers, and several important business associates began quietly distancing themselves from dealings with him, wary of being associated with what they perceived as a personal scandal that might reflect poorly on their own reputations. Edmund urged patience once again, cautioning Alaric against responding to Lord Vale's provocations with anger or public confrontation, which would only fuel further gossip and draw more attention to the situation. Let your actions speak louder than any rumor, Edmund advised. If you truly intend to acknowledge Eliza and your child publicly, do so with dignity and clarity, rather than reacting defensively to whatever nonsense Vale chooses to spread. Alaric took this advice seriously, though it required considerable restraint on his part, particularly when he encountered Lord Vale directly at a social gathering, hosted by a mutual acquaintance. Vale approached him with a thin, knowing smile, clearly hoping to provoke a reaction that would further damage Alaric's standing among their peers. I hear your seamstress has grown quite round with child, Vale said quietly, just loud enough for a few nearby guests to overhear. Tell me, Wintermere, do you intend to actually marry the girl, or simply continue paying for her silence from a comfortable distance? Alaric felt anger rising sharply within him, the old impulse to respond with cutting words, or even physical confrontation flaring briefly, before he forced himself to breathe deeply and consider his response carefully. He thought of Edmund's advice, of the letter he had received from Eliza, of everything he had begun to learn about the difference between reacting from wounded pride and responding with genuine integrity. I intend to marry her, yes, Alaric said calmly, his voice steady, despite the tension in the room around them. Not because scandal demands it, but because I have finally come to understand what she deserves, and what I failed to give her for far too long. I am grateful, honestly, for the opportunity to correct that mistake, regardless of what gossip surrounds it. His calm, direct response caught Lord Vale off guard, clearly expecting either denial or defensive anger, rather than genuine acknowledgement. Several guests nearby exchanged surprised glances, and Alaric noticed, with some satisfaction, that his measured honesty seemed to diffuse much of the malicious energy Vale had hoped to stir up. Word of this exchange spread through social circles nearly as quickly as the original scandal, though this time the narrative shifted somewhat in Alaric's favor. Rather than being portrayed purely as a man caught in an embarrassing scandal, he began to be seen, cautiously, as someone attempting genuine reform, willing to acknowledge his mistakes publicly, rather than hiding behind wealth and privilege, as many in his position might have chosen to do. This shift in perception did not erase the scandal entirely, nor did it immediately restore all the business relationships that had grown strained in recent weeks. But it did begin, slowly, to change the conversation surrounding Alaric's situation, and news of his public acknowledgement eventually made its way, through various channels, back to Millbrook, where it reached Eliza in a far more accurate form than the earlier exaggerated rumors had taken. She read an account of the exchange with Lord Vale, in a brief mention, within a letter, from a distant cousin, who occasionally corresponded with people connected to Ravensmoor's social circle. The description, while second-hand, matched closely enough with what she already knew of Alaric's recent letter that she found herself believing, cautiously, that his change might indeed be genuine, rather than simply a temporary performance driven by fear of scandal. Still, she reminded herself of Margaret's wisdom regarding sustained actions over time, rather than isolated moments of apparent integrity. She continued her quiet life in Millbrook, working steadily at the shop, growing closer to both Winifred and Margaret, and preparing, as best she could, for the arrival of her child, while allowing herself only cautious hope regarding whatever future might eventually unfold between herself and Alaric. Neither of them yet knew how much further this journey would take them before any true resolution could be reached, but both, in their own separate ways, were beginning to understand that genuine change required far more patience and humility than either had previously possessed. Weeks turned into months, and life in Millbrook settled into a steady, familiar pattern for Eliza. Her condition had progressed considerably, and she now moved more slowly through her days, though she refused to give up her work at Margaret's shop entirely, insisting on continuing as long as she reasonably could. Margaret had grown fond of Eliza in ways that went beyond simple employer and worker, treating her almost as a daughter she never had. She often stayed late at the shop, teaching Eliza more advanced techniques of dressmaking that would allow her to earn a better living once the baby arrived, and she needed more flexible, better-paying work to support them both. "You have a gift for this," Margaret told her one afternoon, examining a particularly intricate piece of embroidery Eliza had completed on a wealthy customer's gown. "With enough practice, you could open your own shop someday, if that is something you might want." The idea took root in Eliza's mind, growing steadily over the following weeks. She had never considered herself capable of running her own business, having spent so many years believing her worth depended entirely on her relationship with a man of higher standing. The possibility of building something entirely her own, something that belonged to no one but herself and eventually her child, filled her with a quiet, growing excitement she had not expected to feel during such an uncertain period of her life. Winifred, too, continued to offer steady support, helping Eliza prepare a small nursery in the cottage, sharing stories of her own experiences, raising children many years earlier, before her husband had passed, and left her alone in the small home she now shared with her niece. The two women grew closer with each passing week, their bond deepening through shared responsibility and mutual affection. Meanwhile, at Ravensmoor, Alaric continued the slow, deliberate work of demonstrating genuine change through consistent action, rather than empty words. He had taken to visiting the tenant farms personally, listening to concerns he had previously ignored, addressing practical problems with the same attention he had once reserved only for matters directly affecting his own comfort and wealth. His relationship with Edmund had deepened as well, no longer simply that of two friends who occasionally drank brandy together and discussed business matters, but something closer to genuine partnership, with Edmund serving as a steady voice of reason and honest feedback whenever Alaric's old instincts toward impatience or arrogance threatened to resurface. "You have changed more in these past months than I would have believed possible," Edmund told him one evening, as they reviewed correspondence related to the estate's growing charitable efforts, another initiative Alaric had begun, as part of his broader attempt to become a better version of himself. "I only hope Eliza will eventually see the same change, and trust that it represents who you have truly become, rather than a temporary performance." Alaric nodded, though a familiar anxiety still lingered beneath his growing confidence. He had continued writing to Eliza periodically, careful letters that shared updates about his efforts at reform, without pressuring her toward any particular response or timeline. She replied occasionally, her letters gradually growing warmer in tone, though still maintaining a careful distance that reminded him she had not yet fully decided what role, if any, he might play in her future. He learned, through these exchanges, small details about her life in Millbrook that filled him with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet longing. He learned of her growing skill as a seamstress, of the kindness shown to her by Margaret and Winifred, of the small nursery being prepared for their child's arrival. Each detail made him more aware of everything he had missed by failing to truly know her during their years together at Ravensmoor, and more determined to earn the chance to know her properly now. As Eliza's due date approached, her letters grew shorter, understandably consumed by the practical demands of preparing for childbirth and managing her increasingly demanding physical condition. Alaric found himself anxious during this period, worried constantly about her well-being, despite the distance between them, unable to offer any direct support beyond the occasional letter and the money he continued sending discreetly, which Eliza had reluctantly agreed to accept for the sake of the child's needs, even while insisting on maintaining her own independent income through her work at the shop. One evening, a letter arrived at Ravensmoor that immediately struck Alaric as different from her usual careful, measured correspondence. The handwriting appeared slightly less steady than usual, and the message itself was brief, informing him simply that her time was approaching sooner than expected, and that Margaret had already arranged for a midwife to attend when the moment came. Alaric read the letter with growing concern, recognizing the underlying anxiety beneath her carefully controlled words. He found himself unable to simply wait passively for further updates, torn between respecting the boundaries Eliza had established and his own growing need to be present, in whatever way she might allow, during such a significant and potentially dangerous moment in her life. He discussed the matter with Edmund late into the night, weighing the risks of appearing unwelcome and intrusive against the deeper fear of remaining absent during a moment that might prove far more perilous than either of them wanted to acknowledge openly. Childbirth carried real dangers, even under the best circumstances, and Alaric found himself haunted by stories he had heard over the years of women who had not survived the experience. "I cannot simply sit here and wait for news that may or may not arrive in time," Alaric finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled worry. "I need to go to Millbrook, not to demand anything from her, but simply to be nearby, in case she needs anything at all during this time." Edmund considered this carefully before responding. "If you go, you must be prepared to remain in the background entirely, respecting whatever distance she still requires. This cannot become about your own need for reassurance or forgiveness. It must remain entirely about supporting her and the child, without any expectation of immediate reconciliation." Alaric agreed readily, understanding clearly that this journey needed to be undertaken with humility, rather than any lingering sense of entitlement. He departed for Millbrook the following morning, traveling with only a small number of trusted attendants, deliberately avoiding any grand procession that might draw unwanted attention or pressure upon Eliza during such a vulnerable time. The journey took the better part of 2 days, and Alaric found himself growing increasingly anxious with each passing mile, uncertain exactly what he would find upon arrival, or whether Eliza would even wish to see him, given the sensitive circumstances of her impending delivery. He arrived in Millbrook late in the evening, taking modest lodging at a small inn near the town center, choosing to remain there rather than approaching Winifred's cottage directly, mindful of respecting the boundaries he and Edmund had discussed. He sent a brief, carefully worded note to the cottage the following morning, informing Eliza of his presence in town, and making clear that he had no intention of intruding upon her privacy, or pressuring her in any way. He simply wished her to know that he was nearby, should she need anything at all, and that he would remain quietly at the inn, awaiting whatever response, if any, she chose to offer. The note reached Eliza just as she was beginning to feel the first uncertain signs that her labor might be approaching sooner than even her most recent letter had suggested. She read his words with a complicated mixture of emotions, surprised by his presence in town, yet strangely comforted by the careful respect he had shown in choosing not to appear at her doorstep uninvited. She did not respond immediately, her attention quickly consumed by the growing intensity of the sensations she was experiencing, sensations that Winifred, upon noticing her niece's discomfort, quickly recognized as the genuine early stages of labor, rather than the false alarms Eliza had experienced once or twice in previous weeks. Margaret was summoned immediately, along with the midwife who had been arranged in advance for exactly this moment, and the small cottage soon became a hub of careful, purposeful activity, as the women prepared for what promised to be a long and difficult process ahead. Alaric, still waiting at the inn, remained unaware of exactly how quickly events were unfolding at the cottage, though something in the quiet tension of the town itself, or perhaps simply his own heightened anxiety, told him that today might prove to be a day of tremendous significance, one way or another, for the woman he had traveled so far to be near, even if only from a careful, respectful distance. The hours that followed proved long and difficult, exactly as such moments often are, filled with periods of intense effort, followed by brief, exhausted rest, as Eliza labored through the process of bringing her child into the world. Margaret remained by her side throughout, holding her hand firmly during the most challenging moments, while Winifred managed the practical details of the household, ensuring the midwife had everything needed and that the small nursery stood ready for the newborn's arrival. Word of Eliza's labor reached Alaric late that afternoon, delivered by a young boy Margaret had sent from the cottage, with instructions to inform the Duke, discreetly, that Eliza's time had come. The boy found Alaric pacing anxiously in the small courtyard behind the inn, having grown too restless to remain seated indoors any longer. Alaric thanked the boy and pressed a coin into his hand, though his mind remained entirely consumed by worry for Eliza's well-being. He resisted every urge to rush immediately to the cottage, remembering clearly the boundaries he had promised to respect, yet finding it nearly impossible to simply remain idle, while such a significant, potentially dangerous event unfolded so close by. He spent the following hours walking the streets of Millbrook, unable to settle his restless energy into any single activity. He thought of everything that had led to this moment, the years of comfortable blindness at Ravensmoor, the painful shock of finding Eliza's room empty, the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding himself into someone worthy of her trust. Now, as she faced one of the most significant and dangerous moments of her life, he found himself utterly powerless to offer any direct assistance, reduced simply to waiting, hoping, and quietly praying for news that all remained well. As evening settled over the town, Alaric found himself standing near the edge of the road, leading toward Winifred's cottage, close enough to see the warm glow of candlelight through the windows, yet far enough to respect the distance he had promised to maintain. He remained there for what felt like hours, watching shadows move occasionally across the windows, imagining the scene unfolding within, but unable to know for certain exactly what was happening. Finally, well past midnight, the front door of the cottage opened, and Margaret stepped outside, her expression difficult to read in the dim moonlight. She spotted Alaric standing at a respectful distance down the road, and walked toward him slowly, her steps deliberate, giving him no immediate indication of what news she carried. Alaric's heart pounded as she approached, fear and hope warring within him in equal measure. When she finally stood close enough to speak without raising her voice, she offered him a small, tired smile that immediately eased some of the crushing tension in his chest. "She is well," Margaret said simply. "Exhausted, but well. You have a daughter, Your Grace. A healthy, strong little girl." Relief flooded through Alaric so completely that his legs nearly gave way beneath him. He had not realized, until that exact moment, how much fear had accumulated within him over the preceding hours, fear he had not fully acknowledged even to himself. A daughter. He had a daughter, and Eliza, remarkably, had come through the ordeal safely. "May I see her?" he asked, his voice unsteady with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Eliza, I mean. Only if she wishes it. I do not want to intrude if she needs rest." Margaret studied him for a long moment before answering, as though weighing something important in her own mind. "She asked me to bring you, if you were still here. She said she wanted you to see your daughter, at least once, before deciding anything further about what comes next between the two of you." Alaric followed Margaret back toward the cottage, his steps careful and quiet, mindful of not disturbing the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over the small home following such an intense ordeal. Winifred greeted him at the door with a polite but measured expression, clearly still uncertain about his true intentions, despite everything Eliza had shared with her over recent months. He was led to a small bedroom, where Eliza lay propped up against several pillows, exhaustion evident in every line of her face, yet her eyes bright with a soft, protective warmth as she looked down at the small bundle, cradled carefully in her arms. She glanced up as Alaric entered the room, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had happened between them settling quietly into the space separating them. "Come see her," Eliza finally said softly, her voice gentle despite her obvious fatigue. Alaric approached slowly, almost reverently, and knelt beside the bed to look down at the tiny face of his daughter for the first time. She was small, delicate, with a soft tuft of dark hair, and features that seemed to hold traces of both her parents already, even in these first hours of life. Something shifted profoundly within Alaric as he looked at her, a depth of feeling entirely different from anything he had experienced before, protective and tender, in ways that immediately reshaped his understanding of what truly mattered in his life. "She is beautiful," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Eliza, for everything, for trusting me enough to let me see her, even after everything I put you through." Eliza watched him carefully, studying his expression with the same careful attention she had always brought to understanding him, even during their years together when he had rarely offered her the same depth of consideration in return. She saw genuine emotion in his face now, unguarded in a way she had rarely witnessed during their time at Ravensmoor, when his composure had always seemed carefully maintained, even in private moments between them. "I have thought a great deal about your letters these past months," Eliza said slowly, choosing her words carefully despite her exhaustion. "About the changes you described, and whether they represented something real, or simply a temporary reaction born from shock and fear of scandal." Alaric nodded, understanding completely why she would harbor such doubts, given everything that had happened between them. "I cannot ask you to simply trust my words alone," he said. I can only continue showing you, through my actions over time, that the changes I have made are genuine and lasting, regardless of whether you ever choose to return to any life connected with mine." Eliza studied him for a long moment, her expression difficult to read through her exhaustion, before finally speaking again. "I do not know yet what our future holds, Alaric. I have built something here in Millbrook that matters deeply to me, an independence I never truly possessed during our years together. I am not willing to simply abandon that, even for the sake of our daughter having both her parents present in her daily life. I would never ask you to abandon what you have built here," Alaric said firmly, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "If anything, I have come to admire deeply everything you have accomplished since leaving Ravensmoor. Whatever future we might build together, if you are ever willing to consider such a thing, it must include and respect the independence and strength you have discovered here, rather than asking you to set it aside." Eliza's eyes softened slightly at these words, though she remained cautious, unwilling to commit to any specific promises given the significant history of disappointment between them. "We shall see, Alaric. For now, I ask only that you allow me time to recover, and time to consider what role you might play, if any, in our daughter's life going forward." Alaric agreed readily, grateful simply for the chance to have witnessed his daughter's first hours of life, and for the small, tentative opening Eliza had offered him regarding a possible future between them. He remained only a short while longer, careful not to overstay his welcome during such an exhausting time, before returning quietly to the inn, his mind now filled with new purpose and renewed determination to prove, through sustained action rather than mere words, that he had truly become someone worthy of the family he hoped, eventually, to properly claim. The following weeks would test that determination, in ways neither of them yet fully anticipated, as the practical realities of building trust, after such significant harm, proved far more complicated than either had initially imagined during the emotional intensity of that first meeting with their newborn daughter. Alaric remained in Millbrook for several days following his daughter's birth, taking modest lodging at the small inn, rather than returning immediately to Ravensmoor. He visited the cottage each afternoon, always brief, always careful to respect the boundaries Eliza had established, though each visit allowed him to grow slightly closer to understanding the daughter he had named, together with Eliza, Rosalind, after a grandmother on Eliza's side of the family, whom she had always spoken of with particular fondness. During these visits, Alaric began to notice details about Eliza's new life that filled him with growing respect and quiet admiration. He watched how Margaret and Winifred treated her, not as someone dependent on their charity, but as a valued member of their small household, someone whose opinions mattered and whose contributions were genuinely appreciated. He saw, in the careful, practiced way Eliza handled Rosalind, a confidence and competence that had perhaps always existed within her, but had rarely found opportunity to fully develop during her years of quiet waiting at Ravensmoor. "You have built something remarkable here," Alaric told her one afternoon, as she sat by the window, nursing Rosalind, while he remained seated a respectful distance away. "I understand now, more than I did before, why returning to Ravensmoor would mean giving up something genuinely valuable, not simply comfort and material wealth." Eliza looked up at him, slightly surprised by the depth of understanding in his words. "It has taken time," she admitted. "But yes, I have found something here that I am not eager to lose, regardless of what happens between us." Alaric nodded, understanding clearly that any future reconciliation would require him to fundamentally reconsider what such a future might look like, rather than simply expecting Eliza to return to the exact same arrangement she had left behind. He began, during these quiet conversations, to propose ideas that reflected this new understanding, suggestions that acknowledged her independence, rather than simply asking her to surrender it. "What if," he said carefully one evening, choosing his words with unusual deliberation, "our future together, should you ever wish for one, did not require you to give up what you have built here entirely? What if you could maintain your work, your independence, your connections with Margaret and Winifred, while also allowing me to be present in Rosalind's life, and perhaps, eventually, in yours as well, in whatever form felt right to you?" Eliza considered this proposal carefully, recognizing in it a genuine shift from the man who had once assumed her presence in his life required no particular effort or accommodation on his part. "That is different from anything you offered before," she said slowly. "Before, I was simply expected to remain hidden, waiting for whatever attention you chose to give me, whenever it suited your schedule. I know, Alaric said quietly, shame evident in his voice despite his effort to remain composed. I have thought a great deal about how differently I would need to approach any future with you, if you were ever willing to consider one. I do not want simply to recreate the same arrangement that caused you so much unhappiness. I want to build something genuinely different, something built on actual partnership and respect, rather than convenience and quiet expectation. These conversations continued over the following weeks, as Alaric divided his time between necessary visits to Ravensmoor to attend to estate matters, and extended stays in Millbrook to remain present in his daughter's early life, and to continue rebuilding trust with Eliza through patient, consistent effort, rather than grand gestures or empty promises. Margaret and Winifred, initially cautious about Alaric's intentions, gradually began to soften their guarded attitudes as they witnessed the genuine consistency of his behavior over these weeks. He never demanded anything, never pressured Eliza toward decisions she was not ready to make, and consistently demonstrated respect for the independent life she had built in their small community. "He has changed a great deal since I first heard about him," Margaret admitted to Eliza one evening, as they closed the shop together after a long day of work. "I was prepared to distrust him entirely, given everything you told me about your years together. But watching him these past weeks, I begin to believe his change might genuinely be real, rather than simply a temporary performance." Eliza smiled slightly at this assessment, feeling a similar cautious hope growing within her own heart, though she remained careful not to allow this hope to overwhelm her practical judgment entirely. She had been disappointed before, had trusted promises that ultimately proved hollow, and she was determined not to make the same mistake again, without genuine, sustained evidence that Alaric's transformation represented lasting change, rather than temporary reaction to crisis. As months passed, Alaric's visits to Millbrook became a regular, established pattern, rather than an occasional exception, and Rosalind grew steadily, developing her first small smiles, and eventually her first attempts at grasping objects placed within her tiny reach. Alaric found himself present for many of these small milestones, experiencing a depth of paternal joy he had never anticipated feeling, having spent so many years focused primarily on his own comfort and advancement, rather than considering what genuine family connection might feel like. His relationship with Eliza, meanwhile, evolved slowly, cautiously, from the awkward distance of their initial post-separation meetings towards something resembling genuine friendship, built gradually through shared concern for their daughter's well-being and increasingly honest conversations about their respective hopes for the future. During one particular visit, several months after Rosalind's birth, Alaric arrived in Millbrook, carrying news that would prove significant for the path their relationship might eventually take. He explained, carefully, that he had begun the process of formally acknowledging Rosalind as his legitimate daughter through legal documentation, regardless of whether he and Eliza ever married, ensuring that his daughter would carry his name and inherit certain protections and rights, rather than remaining vulnerable to the social stigma often attached to children born outside of formal marriage. "I want her to have every advantage and protection I can offer her," Alaric explained, "regardless of what happens between us. This is not something I am doing to convince you toward reconciliation. It is simply the right thing to do for our daughter, and I should have considered it far sooner than I did." Eliza was deeply moved by this gesture, recognizing in it a genuine prioritization of Rosalind's well-being over any personal agenda Alaric might harbor regarding their own relationship. It represented exactly the kind of sustained, meaningful action that Margaret had spoken of months earlier. Action that demonstrated genuine character, rather than empty words offered in a moment of emotional crisis. "Thank you," Eliza said softly, genuine gratitude evident in her voice. "This means a great deal to me, Alaric, more than you perhaps realize." Their conversation that evening continued longer than usual, both of them growing increasingly comfortable discussing not only practical matters concerning Rosalind, but also more personal reflections about their own individual growth over the preceding months. Alaric spoke honestly about the ongoing changes he continued making at Ravensmoor, the deeper relationships he had built with his tenants and staff, the genuine friendship he now shared with Edmund that extended far beyond their earlier, more superficial companionship. Eliza, in turn, shared her own growing ambitions regarding her work as a seamstress, mentioning for the first time the possibility Margaret had suggested months earlier of eventually opening her own shop rather than continuing to work for someone else indefinitely. Alaric listened with genuine interest and encouragement, offering practical suggestions regarding potential locations and resources without ever pressuring her toward any particular decision. As the evening drew to a close and Alaric prepared to return to his lodging at the inn, Eliza found herself, for the first time since their separation, feeling something beyond cautious tolerance toward his continued presence in her life. She recognized, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, that genuine affection remained between them, tempered now by hard-earned wisdom regarding what a healthy, respectful relationship actually required from both partners involved. She did not share these feelings directly with Alaric that evening, still uncertain about the wisdom of moving too quickly toward reconciliation after everything that had happened between them. But as she watched him depart down the quiet street toward his inn, carrying with him the easy affection he now showed openly toward their daughter, and the genuine respect he had learned to demonstrate toward her own independence and ambitions, she allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine a future that might genuinely include him, built on foundations entirely different from the quiet, hidden arrangement that had once defined their relationship. Nearly a year had passed since Eliza's departure from Ravensmoor, and Rosalind had grown into a lively, curious child, taking her first unsteady steps across the floor of Winifred's cottage, under the watchful, delighted eyes of both her mother and her father, who now visited so regularly that his presence in Millbrook had become entirely unremarkable to the townspeople who had grown accustomed to seeing him. The scandal that had once surrounded Alaric's situation had largely faded from public conversation, exactly as Margaret had predicted so many months earlier. Lord Grantham Vale had eventually turned his attention toward other targets for his gossip, and the wider society that once whispered about the Duke's hidden mistress had grown accustomed to a different narrative entirely, one that spoke of Alaric's public acknowledgement of his daughter and his evident commitment to building a genuine, respectable future for his small family. During this period, Eliza had taken significant steps toward realizing her own ambitions. With careful savings accumulated through her steady work at Margaret's shop, along with a modest but respectful contribution from Alaric that she had finally agreed to accept as support for their daughter's future, rather than any form of personal obligation, she had begun renting a small space of her own in Millbrook's town center, gradually establishing her own independent seamstress business alongside Margaret's continued mentorship and support. The shop, modest as it was in its early days, quickly began attracting customers drawn by Eliza's evident skill and the genuine care she brought to every piece of work she completed. Word spread through the town and eventually beyond, and within months, she found herself needing to hire additional help simply to keep pace with growing demand for her services. Alaric watched this transformation with evident pride, careful never to take credit for her success or to suggest that his financial support had been the primary factor behind her achievements. He understood clearly, through months of careful reflection, that Eliza's success belonged entirely to her own talent, determination, and hard work, and he made a point of acknowledging this openly whenever the subject arose in conversation with others. She built this entirely through her own effort, he told Edmund, during one of Edmund's occasional visits to Millbrook, to check on his friend's progress. I offered only modest support for our daughter's needs. Everything else, the skill, the reputation, the growing business, belongs entirely to Eliza. Edmund, who had watched this entire transformation unfold with genuine interest over the preceding year, could not help but express his admiration for how thoroughly both Alaric and Eliza had grown through the difficult circumstances that had once seemed to threaten their futures so severely. You have both become entirely different people from who you were a year ago, Edmund observed. I confess I did not expect such genuine growth from either of you, though I am glad to see it. As Rosalind's first birthday approached, Alaric found himself contemplating a significant decision, one he had been carefully considering for several weeks, without yet raising directly with Eliza. He wanted to propose marriage, not as a demand or an expectation, but as a genuine offer, built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding they had worked so hard to establish over the preceding year. He discussed the matter carefully with Edmund before taking any action, wanting to ensure his approach reflected genuine consideration for Eliza's independence and hard-earned autonomy, rather than any lingering assumption that she owed him reconciliation, simply because he had made significant efforts toward personal growth. You must make clear, Edmund advised, that any marriage between you would need to preserve everything she has built here in Millbrook. Her shop, her friendships, her independence. If she agrees to marry you, it must be a genuine choice, built on equal partnership, not a return to the arrangement she originally fled. Alaric took this advice seriously, spending considerable time planning exactly how he might present such a proposal, ensuring it reflected the depth of understanding he had developed regarding what Eliza truly needed and deserved, rather than simply what would be convenient for restoring his own social standing or personal desires. He chose a quiet evening, several days before Rosalind's first birthday celebration, to finally raise the subject directly with Eliza. They sat together in the small garden behind her shop, Rosalind already asleep for the evening under Winifred's watchful care back at the cottage, the warm evening air carrying the scent of blooming flowers Eliza had planted herself along the garden's edges. "I have thought carefully about what I want to say to you," Alaric began, his voice steady despite evident nervousness beneath his composed exterior. "I do not wish to rush you toward any decision you are not ready to make. But I want you to know clearly what I hope for, should you ever be willing to consider it." Eliza watched him carefully, sensing the significance of the moment, though she said nothing, allowing him space to continue. "I would like to marry you, Eliza," Alaric said plainly, without elaborate flourish or grand romantic gesture, simply honest and direct in a way that reflected everything he had learned over the preceding year about genuine communication. Not because society expects it, not because it would resolve any lingering scandal, but because I have come to understand, deeply and completely, what genuine partnership actually means, and I want to build that kind of partnership with you, if you are willing. He continued, careful to address the concerns he knew mattered most to her. "This would not mean asking you to abandon your shop, or your friendships here in Millbrook, or the independence you have worked so hard to establish. If anything, I would want to support all of that continuing exactly as it is, while also building a life together that includes genuine equality between us, rather than the arrangement we once had, where your needs and hopes were consistently secondary to my own comfort and convenience." Eliza remained quiet for a long moment after he finished speaking, considering his words carefully, weighing them against everything she had learned over the preceding year about trust, patience, and genuine character, demonstrated through sustained action, rather than simple promises made in isolated moments. "You understand," she finally said slowly, "that if I agree to this, it would need to look entirely different from our previous arrangement. I would not simply become your hidden mistress once again, dressed up now in the formal title of wife, but still expected to remain quietly in the background of your life." "I understand completely," Alaric confirmed firmly. "You would be my wife in every genuine sense, acknowledged fully and publicly, with your own continued work and independence, fully respected and supported, not merely tolerated, as an inconvenient exception to how things are typically done in society." Eliza studied his face carefully in the fading evening light, searching for any trace of the careless arrogance that had once characterized so much of his behavior toward her. She found, instead, genuine sincerity, hard-earned through a full year of consistent, patient effort to demonstrate real change rather than temporary reaction to crisis. "I need to think carefully about this," Eliza said honestly, unwilling to offer an immediate answer, despite the evident sincerity of his proposal. "Not because I doubt your genuine growth, Alaric. I have watched you change significantly over this past year, and I believe that change to be real. But marriage is a significant decision, one that will affect not only the two of us, but Rosalind as well, and everything I have built here in Millbrook. Take whatever time you need," Alaric said gently. "I will not pressure you toward any particular timeline. I simply wanted you to know clearly where my heart stands, and what kind of future I hope we might build together, should you eventually decide you are ready for such a step." They sat together quietly for a while longer after this conversation, the weight of the significant question now hanging between them, before Alaric eventually took his leave for the evening, returning to his lodging, while Eliza remained alone in the small garden, considering carefully everything that had just been offered to her, and everything such an offer might mean for the future she had worked so hard to build for herself and her daughter. Eliza spent the following days turning Alaric's proposal over carefully in her mind, seeking counsel from both Margaret and Winifred, the two women who had supported her so faithfully throughout the difficult journey of the past year. She valued their perspectives deeply, recognizing that their honest guidance had helped her navigate countless difficult decisions since her arrival in Millbrook. "You must ask yourself," Margaret said thoughtfully, as they sat together in the small shop Eliza now owned. Whether this decision comes from genuine desire for a shared future with him, or simply from a sense of obligation, because he has worked hard to change, or because society might view marriage as the more respectable path for you and Rosalind. Eliza considered this question seriously, spending long hours reflecting on her own feelings, rather than external pressures or expectations. She thought of the year that had passed since her departure from Ravensmoor, of everything she had built independently, of the genuine growth she had witnessed in Alaric through his consistent actions, rather than empty promises. She also thought of the quiet moments they had shared over recent months, watching Rosalind grow together, the easy, comfortable conversations that had gradually replaced the awkward tension of their early post-separation meetings, the genuine partnership they had begun building in how they approached decisions regarding their daughter's upbringing and future. She realized, through this careful reflection, that her feelings toward Alaric extended well beyond simple obligation or practical consideration for Rosalind's benefit. She genuinely cared for him, had perhaps never fully stopped caring for him even during the most difficult early days following her departure, and she found herself, cautiously but genuinely, hopeful about the possibility of building a shared future together, provided that future remained true to everything he had promised, regarding respect for her independence and equal partnership between them. Winifred, when consulted separately, offered similarly thoughtful counsel. "A year is a meaningful amount of time to demonstrate genuine change, my dear. I have watched him myself, these past months, and I no longer see the careless, entitled man you once described to me when you first arrived here. If your heart tells you this represents genuine partnership rather than a return to old patterns, then perhaps it is worth pursuing." After several days of careful consideration, Eliza reached her decision. She sent word to Alaric, requesting that he visit her at the shop the following evening, wanting to deliver her answer in person, in the very space that represented everything she had built independently over the preceding year. Alaric arrived precisely at the appointed time, evident nervousness in his manner, despite his effort to remain composed. Eliza greeted him warmly, leading him into the small back room of the shop, where they had shared so many important conversations over recent months. "I have thought carefully about your proposal," Eliza began, watching his expression closely as she spoke, "and I have decided that I would like to marry you, Alaric, but only under certain conditions, conditions I need you to understand and agree to fully before we proceed any further." Alaric's face lit with evident relief and joy at her initial answer, though he remained attentive, understanding clearly that her conditions mattered as much as her acceptance itself. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. "I am prepared to agree to whatever will ensure this marriage represents the genuine partnership we both deserve." Eliza outlined her conditions carefully, having considered them thoroughly during her days of reflection. She would continue operating her shop in Millbrook, maintaining her independent income and her connections with Margaret and Winifred, regardless of any expectations society might hold regarding a duchess's proper occupations. She would be acknowledged fully and publicly as his wife from the moment of their marriage, with no gradual introduction or careful management of scandal, but immediate, complete recognition of her position and their daughter's legitimacy. She also insisted that major decisions regarding Rosalind's upbringing and any future children they might have together would be made jointly, with her opinions carrying equal weight to his own, rather than simply deferring to his judgment as the head of the household in the traditional sense that governed most noble marriages of their time. Alaric agreed readily to each condition, recognizing in them exactly the kind of genuine partnership he had spent the preceding year learning to value and understand. "I agree completely," he said firmly. "And I want you to know, Eliza, that these conditions are not simply concessions I am making reluctantly to secure your agreement. I genuinely want a marriage built on these principles, one where your voice and your independence remain fully respected throughout our life together." Their engagement was announced shortly afterward, both in Millbrook and among Alaric's social circles at Ravensmoor, and the wedding preparations that followed reflected the genuine partnership they had established between them. Eliza insisted on a modest ceremony that included Margaret and Winifred prominently among the guests, rather than a grand society affair focused entirely on Alaric's noble connections, and Alaric readily agreed, understanding clearly the importance these women held in Eliza's life, and in the genuine support system that had helped her rebuild herself over the preceding year. The wedding day arrived on a bright, clear morning, held in the small church at the edge of Millbrook, rather than the grander cathedral, typically associated with noble unions. Eliza walked down the modest aisle, wearing a simple but elegant gown she had designed and sewn herself, a testament to the skill and independence she had cultivated during her time away from Ravensmoor. Alaric watched her approach with evident emotion, understanding fully the significance of this moment, so different from the quiet, hidden arrangement that had once defined their relationship. Rosalind, now well past her first birthday and taking confident steps of her own, was carried down the aisle by Winifred, just ahead of her mother, a small flower crown resting on her dark hair, drawing gentle laughter and warmth from the assembled guests as she reached eagerly toward her father when she spotted him waiting at the front of the small church. Edmund stood beside Alaric as his closest friend and witness, his expression reflecting genuine pride at how thoroughly his friend had transformed over the preceding year. From a man whose careless arrogance had nearly cost him everything that truly mattered, into someone who had learned, through difficult but necessary experience, what genuine love and respect actually required. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply meaningful, both Alaric and Eliza speaking their vows with evident sincerity, each acknowledging openly the difficult journey that had brought them to this moment, and the genuine commitment they now shared toward building a future defined by equality, respect, and honest partnership, rather than the quiet, hidden arrangement of their earlier years together. Following the ceremony, a modest celebration was held in the garden behind Eliza's shop, attended by the small community that had supported her so faithfully throughout her time in Millbrook, alongside a select few guests from Alaric's world who had proven themselves genuine friends rather than mere social connections during the difficult months of scandal and uncertainty. As the celebration continued into the evening, Alaric found a quiet moment to step away with Eliza, the two of them standing together near the edge of the garden, watching Rosalind play happily nearby, under Margaret's watchful attention. He took Eliza's hand gently in his own, looking at her, with an expression of genuine gratitude and love that reflected everything he had learned over the preceding year. "I once told a friend, quite confidently, that you would never leave me," Alaric said softly, a rueful smile crossing his features as he recalled that fateful evening so many months earlier. "I said it because I believed, foolishly, that your presence in my life was something owed to me, rather than something I needed to genuinely earn, through respect and understanding." Eliza smiled gently at this admission, squeezing his hand warmly in her own. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I understand," Alaric replied, his voice filled with genuine humility and love, "that you never truly needed me at all. You built an entire life, entirely your own, through your own strength and talent. If you choose to remain by my side now, it is not because you need me, but because you genuinely want to, and that makes everything between us infinitely more valuable than anything I foolishly believed I possessed before." Eliza looked at him with warm affection, recognizing in his words the genuine transformation that had taken place over their difficult year apart. A transformation built not on empty promises, but on sustained, patient effort to become someone truly worthy of the family they now shared together. As the sun set gently over Millbrook, casting warm golden light across the small garden filled with friends, family, and the quiet joy of a hard-earned, genuine happiness, Alaric held his daughter close, while Eliza stood beside him, no longer a hidden mistress waiting quietly in the shadows, but a duchess in her own right, respected fully for the strength, talent, and independence that had carried her through the most difficult year of her life, into a future built finally on equal partnership, genuine love, and mutual respect that neither of them would ever again take for granted.